All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the intensely layered history of Curaçao. Now, it's a Caribbean island with incredibly deep indigenous roots, but surprisingly enough to a lot of folks, it functions today as a constituent country of the Dutch kingdom. I mean, think about it. How exactly does an island geographically located just off the coast of South America end up with such a deeply European political structure?
To really wrap our heads around Curaçao's complex modern identity, we have to trace what is essentially an unbroken thread of survival. Today, we're going to deconstruct centuries of colonial myths and explore the island's truly wild journey, from its very first indigenous settlements all the way to its modern autonomous status.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Curaçao roots, then look at the Spanish invasion, where they literally called it a useless island, followed by the Dutch conquest, the grim era of the slave trade, centuries of resistance and evolution, and finally wrap up with modern autonomous Curaçao.
Starting right off with Section 1, the Curaçao roots.
Now, the sheer depth of history here is absolutely staggering. You know, it's kind of easy to fall into the trap of thinking history just started when Europeans showed up in 1499. But actually, native populations were thriving on Curaçao for literally thousands of years. From early rock shelters way back in 2900 BCE to organized, bustling villages cultivating cassava by 500 BCE, the Curaçao people had this deeply established society long before a single Spanish ship ever appeared on the horizon.
And you can clearly see that contrast here. On one hand, you've got the old, frankly dismissive European myth of discovering a wild land. But the reality? We're talking about a vibrant indigenous culture that was deeply connected to this beautiful coastal environment. They navigated these waters, lived off the land, and formed a complex society that early European accounts basically just tried to erase.
So, while the Curaçao language itself did eventually go extinct around the year 1800, its ghosts are definitely still with us. Just look at these words. Indigenous vocabulary describing the local ecosystem, like the Davidivi tree or the dory frog, totally survived. These words wove their way right into Papiamento, which is the island's modern Creole language. It means the original voices of the island are literally still spoken there every single day.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Spanish invasion and why they deemed it a useless island.
Things took a very dark, very fast turn. By 1515, so just a few short years after they arrived, the Spanish had deported roughly 2,000 Curaçaos over to the island of Hispaniola. They were forced to work in mines and on agricultural estates. For a small island population, losing 2,000 people creates a devastating, absolute fracture in their society.
We have this chilling quote from the 16th century friar Bartolomé de las Casas. It impartially but brutally captures the stark reality and the unimaginable scale of the devastation wrought during that early conquest of the West Indies. Entire indigenous systems were just completely upended by this massive colonial expansion. Okay, so here's where we see a massive geopolitical pivot. The Spanish look at Curaçao. They see no precious metals. They realize their style of large-scale farming doesn't really work there, and they literally brand it Isla Inútil, a useless island. But the Dutch West India Company, they look at the exact same piece of rock and see an absolute gold mine. They saw massive strategic potential in St. Anna Bay, which was just perfect for trade, privateering, and salt mining.
Which brings us to Section 3, Dutch conquest and commerce.
In 1634, the trajectory of the island flips again. Under the command of Admiral Johan van Walbeek, the Dutch roll in and violently invade. They boot out the remaining Spaniards, heavily militarize the whole place, and construct Fort Amsterdam right at the mouth of the bay. Almost overnight, they transform the island from a neglected Spanish cattle ranch into a highly fortified Dutch commercial stronghold.
Now we have to talk about Section 4,
The slave trade era.
Because that Dutch focus on commerce, it quickly mutated into something incredibly dark. Just take a look at this number. In a tiny 7-year window between 1662 and 1669, an astonishing 24,000 enslaved people from Africa were shipped through Curaçao by traders like Grillo and Lomelin. The Dutch West India Company essentially used the island as a major transit hub, selling enslaved people to supply the rest of the Americas. It really underscores the island's grim economic engine at the time.
The crucial takeaway here is how deeply intertwined the island's wealth with massive human suffering. In 1674, Curaçao becomes a free port. It's an absolute economic boom for the Dutch colonists, but it was built entirely on the transatlantic slave trade and forced labor on local plantations.
This brutally and permanently altered the demographic and cultural makeup of the entire island.
Let's step into Section 5, Resistance and Evolution.
Now, the people of Curaçao did not just sit back and passively accept their subjugation. Not at all. Look at this timeline. It's defined by fierce pushback. In 1795, a man named Tula leads a massive slave uprising. And even after the Dutch finally abolished slavery in 1863, severe economic inequality stuck around. Jump to 1914, oil is discovered in Venezuela, Shell builds a massive refinery on Curaçao, and the economy shifts to wage labor. But that inequality? Still there. And that leads directly to the explosive 1969 30 de May workers' strike, where marginalized populations forcefully demanded equal footing, better pay, and real political representation.
And through literally all of this turmoil, the island's cultural resilience is just staggering. I mean, check this out. It's the 1880s. After centuries of colonization, brutal slavery, and heavy industrialization, and researchers are still finding elders who remember actual phrases from the original Kakatiyo language. Stuff like hira mu for how's it going. The island's foundational identity just flat out refused to be erased. Which leads us to our final section, Part 6, Modern Autonomous Curaçao.
For decades, Curaçao was part of the Netherlands Antilles. It was this complex, multi-tiered system that frankly operated a lot like middle management in a giant corporation. But on October 10, 2010, or 10-10-10, Curaçao finally stepped out of that bulky structure. Today, it operates as a highly autonomous constituent country within the Dutch kingdom. We're talking its own prime minister, a vibrant multi-party democratic system, managing its own day-to-day affairs, while still being constitutionally tied to Europe.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. Over 2,000 years of indigenous survival, total colonial devastation, and now modern European autonomy, how does a culture built on such profound historical contradictions continue to evolve? How will Curaçao assert its unique, unbroken voice in the world's next chapter? Definitely something to think about the next time you look at a map of the Caribbean. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.